Well, Andy, thanks for coming into 160 Studios.
Joe, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Coming down from the Beltway, did you hit any traffic on the way down?
No traffic. I'll clear sailing all the way.
Good, good. So you've been at the helm of MDIC for how long now?
Just over a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you came from a sister or brother organization, AdvaMed, where you had a really long tenure there and you got to see what great looks like.
I did. AdvaMed's a fantastic organization. I think most folks, most of your viewers know that AdvaMed's one of the leading lobbying organizations for the device industry, 400 plus member companies. I was there for about 12 years in various different roles. And it was a fantastic experience, a great way to get to know the industry and the players and the issues.
Yeah. And now MDIC you came into, and the interesting thing is you and I were chatting in the green room. You chat about AdvaMed, I know it, right? You chat about, if you're from Boston, Mass Medic, I know it. But then when you say MDIC, people's like, I think I understand MDIC, but how would you share MDIC with our viewers today and where you intend on taking it with the team?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, I'll say MDIC is a hidden gem in the med tech world, right? And I knew about MDIC because I was at AdvaMed, and I knew about MDIC when it was first formed a little over 10 years ago. But until I came into this role, I did not appreciate the work that MDIC is doing. And you put your finger on one of our challenges, which is we need to be better known. And the work we're doing is fantastic. We're producing really useful tools for the industry, and we have a fantastic collaborative platform for industry and regulators and other key stakeholders to come together and work collaboratively on solutions to vexing challenges in the whole life cycle for medical technology. But we're not well known enough to have the impact that we want to have. So what we're really focused on is driving more awareness of the organization, driving more participation by companies in particular, and in so doing, we'll have more impact over time.
And it's known also, it's described as a public-private sort of partnership. How would you define that further?
So public-private in our context really means that what we have is a peer-to-peer relationship between private industry and government agencies. And of course, we have other key stakeholders around the table as well, patient advocacy organizations, clinicians, and others. And public-private in this case means that it's literally a combination of public stakeholders and private stakeholders coming together as peers around the same table. So when we talk about our members at MDIC, members are not just the leading medical technology developers, but they also include FDA, for example, and CMS and NIH. And those agencies are actually members of MDIC. So if you come in as a medtech innovator and you sit down at the MDIC table, you're sitting around the table and next to staff from FDA. Jeff Shuren, of course, is on our board, and Tamara Serig-Jensen at CMS, who leads the coverage and analysis group, is on our board. And we're not at arm's length and an advocacy lobbying type relationship, the way AdvaMed is, or for example, or MDMA, right, two of the great advocacy organizations for the industry. Those are lobbying organizations, and we are an advocacy organization, but not lobbying, right? We don't work on regulatory policy or statutory policy. We sit together with these agency leaders and their staff across their organizations to identify what the most problematic challenges are in the medtech lifecycle, whether it's improving quality in the early stages of ideation and manufacturing, or it's driving down to higher quality submissions and more efficient regulatory processes, or looking down at those next stage gates of how do you bring more persuasive information to payers to drive coverage decisions that are better informed. All of those challenges, all the way down to adoption and implementation at the clinical and patient level, we're working collaboratively with all these stakeholders, including the agencies, to determine what the best solutions are. Underlying regulation, underlying guidance and statutory guidance direction is what are the tools that we can develop? How do we develop better processes? How do we evaluate things like real world evidence, right? How do stakeholder or decision makers at the government level really think about incorporating real world evidence in a way that still supports safe and effective decision making or reasonable and necessary for Medicare coverage? How do you actually do that in a fast-paced, evolving world, around digital health and healthcare data? So those are the kinds of issues we work on. But back to your key point is public-private consortium means we're working collaboratively between private and public stakeholders. We can get a lot done that way. We can move, fairly quickly, and there's no adversarial relationship. It is all completely collaborative. What are our mutual pain points? How do we all work together for the betterment of patient health?
And I was at the annual meeting last year, and it's coming up pretty soon, and we'll talk about that as well. And I was so impressed at the intimacy with, again, Jeff Shuren there, and the decision makers in a very cozy, intimate environment, questions answered, clarity. What I was really amazed at was there were so few investors there, because when you think about coverage, CMS, approval, clearance, all that informs investment strategy. And so
Exactly.
I'm going to be curious to see how many of the VCs and PE start to lean into the MDIC as it becomes better and better known.
Yeah, well, I think that's just one example of the opportunity that we have to have a wider level of participation and awareness. And I will say that fundamentally that comes down to what kind of impact are we having as an organization, right? Because we have a fantastic library of toolkits and case studies and opportunities for industries to adopt new tools and drive efficiencies and improvements in all of their processes, including bringing better practices and information into FDA submissions. But there are other stakeholders who don't yet know that we exist or don't yet know enough about us to really benefit from our work. And obviously the investment community is one of those. I expect that we'll be bringing in more and more from the investment side to understand the tools that we have to bring to their portfolio companies, for example. Those are conversations we're having right now.
And let's talk about that for a second. EFS, that came out of MDIC, didn't it?
Yes, exactly. So early feasibility studies is a significant program of MDICs that we've been working on for a long time. And it's one example, it's a great example of how we produce actual tools that are useful for entities to drive their commercial activities in healthcare and med tech development. So for example, in the early feasibility studies program, we've developed template contracts for med tech innovators to enter into with clinical sites. And through the use of the various tools that we've developed, we've seen clinical trial sites expedite the enrollment of patients and get to full enrollment and initiate trials, in some cases months faster than they had been previously, because we've developed these template approaches. We've resolved a lot of the standard issues that everybody addresses, take 80% of the issues off the table, use our templates, negotiate the 20% that might be specific to these entities or that particular trial, and everything gets expedited. And that's just one example of the kind of tools we're bringing to the market.
And months in a startup is millions of dollars.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, at the burn rate. Also, Nest. So that's an amazing program that very few people know the details of. And Nest just had a relatively meaningful win with J&J and Biosense Webster. Share that.
Yes, exactly. So first, a little bit of background. The National Evaluation System for Health Technologies, or NEST, is a program of MDIC, and it was started about 5 years ago. And it was really focused on further developing real-world evidence that can be used in submissions to the Food and Drug Administration, right? So exploring the whole realm of real-world evidence and figuring how to better bring together real-world data, how to analyze it, and put it in a form that's relevant to the safe and effective decision-making that FDA needs to make. So over the last kind of MEDUFA in the last sort of funding cycle, NEST was particularly focused on validating new approaches for real-world evidence analysis and looking at fit-for-purpose feasibility studies around real-world data. And now as we're pivoting into a next phase of really driving all of this work into submissions to FDA. And the J&J example you just mentioned was J&J recently just gotten a label extension approval from FDA for its Biosense Webster Thermocool ablation device. And that submission was predicated on real-world evidence developed with NEST. And so it's a great example of where NEST is now going as we pivot into fully focusing on executing an entire pipeline of projects like that with the medical device industry, project by project, focused on bringing more information, better real-world evidence to the FDA.
So you've been there a year now. What were some of the initial challenges, auditing, aha moments in the first year as a leader of this organization?
So when I first came in and I got a quick and new appreciation for the quality of the work that MDIC is doing, the value of the tools that we're developing, the value of the public-private partnership that I just described a moment ago, right? Tremendous value in the organization. What I saw as a challenge were maybe two things. One is we had not developed a really good value proposition for the organization as a whole. We have we have about 8 programs and a number of projects in all those programs, all of which are high value. But we've been really working to better refine the value proposition for the organization at large. But even more fundamentally, as I talked with the board last fall, as I first came in, really we decided that our fundamental strategic focus had to be impact. And we don't want to be an organization that just produces a library of fantastic materials. We need people to actually take those materials, understand them, and adopt them. Right? We need implementation of the work that we're doing in the medtech industry and in collaboration with regulators and payers to actually drive improvements, to drive medtech innovations faster to patients. And so our focus going forward is in both to make the organization better known, bring more companies into our work so they're better prepared to adopt our work, and to really focus on refining our portfolio so that every time we initiate a project, we're not just thinking about the output, but we're thinking about the outcome. Right? That is a kind of a critical turning point for MDIC. We've always done educational work, But we're really focusing now increasingly on what is the outcome we want to see as a result of this work. We're identifying challenges with FDA, or we're identifying challenges with CMS, or with private payers or industry, sitting together and saying, well, these are our challenges and we think these are the solutions. But we need to be able to validate that we're actually driving change, right? So that we produce a product and we can spend another couple of years after that driving adoption, educating players on how to use these tools. And we have about 50 leading medtech developers as members of MDIC, but what about the next 50 and the next 100, right? We really need to get to those next innovators to make sure they can benefit from our work.
You bring up the word innovation, and certainly creeping into it, we hear the words thrown around a lot is AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. And we were chatting before that, that's a double-edged sword. It's a great enabler, but what about the unintended consequences that go with that? What's MDIC watching and guiding in that area?
So obviously, we, like everyone else in healthcare, are fascinated by and looking very closely at tools like generative AI and large language models and all the things that we see already being adopted very quickly in other contexts, right? But of course, as you were just alluding to, we have to be sure that in healthcare we're going slowly enough to get it right, and make sure that we're benefiting patients and not inadvertently leading to some level of harm. Obviously, this is a challenge for regulators, right? It's one thing to go to FDA with a static product and say this is what it does and it'll do that for the next 5 years, and is it safe and effective? But if you have software that is a medical device, or you have software in a medical device, and you really want to harness the power of these emerging AI technologies, you have to have some way for regulators to endorse a product that will change over time, perhaps even on its own in the wild. Right? That's a tremendous challenge that FDA has obviously continued to grapple with, and to the agency's credit, they've been very proactive and forward in exploring that. So I think we'll get there, right? And FDA just put out draft guidance on predetermined change control plans, which is a way of getting on to tell us what you're planning to do with your software, right, over time, and we should be able to expedite approvals and clearances. So part of what we're looking at is simply how do you have a more efficient regulatory process that harnesses the best of these emerging technologies while still ensuring that it's safe and effective by the time it gets to patients. I think, as we were also discussing earlier, that where you're going to see and already are seeing earlier applications of AI in healthcare will not be in the technology themselves. There will be some of that, but you'll see faster and wider adoption in other areas that are wrapping around technology, which is clinical decision making, for example, or aiding clinicians in understanding what's in the literature that they really need to know about. I mean, sifting through massive volumes of information, discriminating in that information. And it's, of course, driving other things like prior authorization decision making in payer contexts and so forth. So the bottom line is, I think it's, we have tremendous opportunities here. We just have to make sure we go slow enough to make sure we're getting it right for patients.
Mm. And we would also talk about health equity. You and I had a conversation about that. That's not a new concept introduced, but it's getting the attention it should get right now in the industry.
Absolutely.
What's the activity that MDIC is undertaking in order to make sure that that is front and center all the time now in the industry?
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you brought that up, right? Because as you just said, everyone in healthcare is now paying the attention to health inequities that they've always deserved. And obviously it's challenging. I'll make one quick point is that, health equity, somewhat like digital health, is not a vertical, right? It's a horizontal. And so that makes it a little more challenging when you're thinking about what does an organization actually do in health equity, an organization like ours, right? With a broad mission and specific focus areas. And so what we're doing right now is we're exploring health equity through the lens of what we do and asking ourselves, in every area where we're working, how do we have to factor in health inequities? Is there some aspect of our work that can reduce health inequities in some place in the healthcare system? So while we don't have a health equities program per se, we're undertaking that exploration right now, and we're driving a lot of conversation with our members, and it'll be a major focus at our annual public forum coming up next month. We have a number of sessions on health equity. We have numerous speakers from payers and CMS and industry and FDA all talking about what does health equity really mean, and therefore, as we think about our work, how do we make that real? How can we contribute in a way that's MDIC specific and we can really make a difference?
MDIC has a very unique, appropriately intimate relationship with the FDA, probably more so than any other organization that is not a pure government play. What was the genesis of that, if you know what it was, and then how does that provide a value to the members of MDIC? You shared some details earlier, but I want to dig in a little deeper on that between the importance of FDA, obviously for the patient first and foremost, but also for the companies.
Yeah, it's a great question. So MDIC was originally came out of some conversations in Minnesota, and therefore our origins actually go back into Medical Alley, the Life Sciences Alley at the time, when Jeff Shuren and a couple of leaders in the medtech industry were just having a conversation about mutual challenges, right? That the industry and the FDA are kind of two sides of a coin, where we're really, we're wrestling with how do we bring better information to decision makers? How do we have processes that are more efficient, get innovations to patients faster? And the idea really coalesced around, well, what if we just sat together in a safe space where we could collaborate and share, in a more transparent way, what our mutual challenges are, and set aside the the advocacy relationship or the I'm the supplicant to FDA, but really say, look, we're partnering up to figure out how we jointly can do a better job for patients and bring innovations faster to patients. And so that was the underlying idea of MDIC and why it was formed as a public-private consortium. Huge credit to Jeff Shuren and other medtech leaders at the time for bringing the organization together in that way, but founded fundamentally on that premise that we would all come together in a pre-competitive, non-competitive space, where FDA could be very candid and transparent about the challenges that it faces as a regulatory agency and what its goals and aims are, and industry likewise could say, well, this is what's really bedeviling about a given process or an expectation from FDA, or there's not enough transparency, or we're really struggling with the underlying kind of science, from regulatory science, or there's something about a technical discipline that's going into, manufacturing quality that's driving, activity around recalls, for example. Can we talk with the FDA about that in a place where not only we're sharing information, but then we're going to work together? Well, what's the solution? What do we bring forward as a roadmap, a toolkit, a framework? And the result is that what MDIC has done over the years is inform agency guidance and rulemaking. So we don't advocate for a specific change in policy. I said that earlier, right? We don't advocate for a particular rule or a particular guidance, but we're working on the underlying disciplines that inform FDA's work there. So we bring forward a framework around incorporating patient input into FDA decision-making, then leads to guidance and rulemaking around how do you actually take patient input and make that, scientifically part of the package that FDA looks at.
And then also creating an awareness around the guidance from the FDA and distributing that appropriately with tools, techniques on these leading edge technologies like surgical robotics, which is constantly emerging, like AI, like machine learning.
That will increasingly be a focus of ours, where we explicitly will say MDIC is a forum and a platform for helping industry understand better how to comply with a given guidance, right? We will not give guidance on the guidance, but we can help industry understand better what to do internally to address a given guidance or expectations around whether it's quality or data in a submission.
Mm-hmm. The annual public forum is coming up in DC. Is it September?
Yes,
so
indeed.
Pretty
September
soon.
19th and 20th.
That's right. So you've reimagined that now. You've had your first year under your belt. I think, in fact, last year when I was there, we saw each other, and I think it was like your first week or two,
it was.
maybe. How have you reimagined that, and what does the structure and form of that look like, and who should be attending that?
So first of all, anyone in medtech really should be attending this conference. There's something there for everyone who's in early stage companies, later stage companies, folks that are working in patient advocacy, thinking about payer challenges and so forth. We have a really robust program kind of covering the key issues in which we work. And the way we've re-envisioned that program is we've gone 2 full days, and we're really explaining to stakeholders, attendees, the broader context of the work that we're doing, right? So it isn't just let us tell you about X program. We're taking it up a level. For example, we're sitting down and having a fireside chat with Deputy Secretary of HHS, Andrea Palm, and talking about cybersecurity, right? So then we're talking about our work in cybersecurity in the broader context as envisioned by one of our top healthcare and cybersecurity leaders. How does MDIC's work play into that, right? And then throughout that whole program, that's exactly the same thing we're doing, right? As we bring in these higher level speakers to talk about the issues on the broader stage of healthcare, and then talk about where MDIC's work fits into that. So it's in a sense, a higher level conference. We're bringing in senior leaders that we haven't had before into our meeting. It's an intimate setting. You mentioned that earlier, right? That's a fantastic benefit, if you will, or an attribute of MDIC is you come to our meeting, with 200 to 300 people. That's a fantastic opportunity to rub shoulders with Jeff Shuren and others at FDA and our CMS speakers, right? And in a setting that's otherwise hard to find.
Mm-hmm. And where do we take MDIC from here? If we look out 36, 48 months from now, and Andy Fish has got his squad together, got your marching orders, working with the FDA and the industry, what does it look like? How does it declare itself? I'm a startup company, or I'm one of the large strategics. How am I gaining value out of my relationship with MDIC?
So you'll see a couple of key things going on. One is you'll see us continue to refine our portfolio to focus on impact. As we select our projects and we drive our work, really be focused on identifying upfront what is the impact we expect this to have. We've identified a problem. We believe we can collaboratively develop this, solution, and we're going to drive that into the market, right? And we're really going to put that out in a way that companies that are early stages can understand what it means for them at a given, stage in the life cycle, or the most sophisticated global leaders in medtech understand what they can get out of the work that we're doing. Secondly, you'll see us then driving that impact through adoption programs, right? We'll be spending time over years even on various projects to ensure that, the entire medical device industry understands the work that we're doing and can implement that in their particular, in their company or in their sphere of influence. And finally, you'll see a much higher level of visibility. We talked earlier about MDIC is really a hidden gem in the medtech arena. And you will see much higher level of visibility from us over time. You'll see a lot more communication. You'll see us showing up in more venues and making ourselves better known. And probably the last component I'll say is we look forward to having more companies actually join MDIC. Other stakeholders as well, but in particular medtech developers, innovating companies coming in and join as members. If you come in and join MDIC as a member, then staff across the entire organization can sit in our various work groups where you'll sit collaboratively with peers from industry, sit collaboratively with agency staff from FDA and other places, and then gain the insight from all those other players at the same time that you're influencing the work that we're doing to drive more innovation.
So if I'm a small emerging tech company, I've got 5 employees and I've got a class 3 device and maybe it's incorporating robotics or AI, there's a spot for me there.
Absolutely. I say that, I hope that everyone always hears this message, but what we like to say is that every company, even in the various early stages, needs to have an entire life cycle lens on innovation. In fact, that's one of the sessions at our upcoming conferences to talk about exactly that, right? Which is, what does that lens on innovation look like? And every innovating company, even in the earliest stages, really needs to have a long-term view. Even if your exit is, somewhere far short of getting to the patient, you really need to understand what that long view is. What ultimately is your product going to have to go through every stage gate along the way? What information set will have to be gathered around that product at every place along that arena, whether it's the next milestone for your investors, whether it's ultimately getting through FDA and a clearance or approval, whether it's getting to coverage decision. We can share with a company at any stage of life cycle which projects and programs we're working on that are relevant directly, at that point to that company. And we can help those early stage leaders be thoughtful about their long-term business plan.
And that's super critical because there are so many first-time CEOs and early investors that might be getting into a category it's their very first investment in because they haven't invested in that category, or even OUS investors or OUS. Can an OUS company from the UK or Israel become a member of MDIC as well?
Of course, absolutely. So our focus has historically been more on the US, right? But we are global in our outlook. We have new global regulators starting to join the organization. MHRA from the UK is now in the organization at MDIC. We welcome companies wherever they may be headquartered to come in and participate in our work. Obviously, it's particularly relevant to the US market, but much of what we're working on is foundational, right? It's not about US regulation or US policy specifically. It's about regulatory science in general. It's about the same technical disciplines that regulators in all the leading countries are looking at, right? So if you come into MDIC here and start learning how you can advance your company with our work, you'll be in a better position with all the leading regulators around the world. So that's clearly an important point. I also just, one quick example. So if you're an early stage, first time CEO or and you're thinking about a complex class 3 product and you're thinking about, okay, well, what data do I need to start building around my product for ultimately being successful at FDA? Real world evidence, the perfect area where you need to really think about, is there a real world evidence strategy that gets me there faster and cheaper, right? Instead of doing traditional clinical trials, maybe there's data out there in the data sets held by healthcare companies or in registries, right, to do some sort of prospective observational study that now very well might get you to that ultimate clearance, or at least get you a huge part of the way down the road. And that's exactly what NEST is focused on, right? We talked earlier about NEST. That is where NEST comes into that situation. You can come to NEST, say, here's what my challenges are, let's devise a project. And we're working intimately with FDA. We're working with FDA to streamline the internal processes. So when a NEST project drives a submission and that submission comes to FDA, a number of questions, because it's a NEST-driven project, are already resolved. Right? That expedites the process internally. A lot of questions are off the table around the quality of the data, the analyses that were performed. Right? We've already resolved that through a NEST project. And then the path to approval and clearance is not guaranteed but it's expedited and you're going to have a much easier time.
And Nest and MDIC also has guidelines and sort of toolboxes for quality, for regulatory, right? For
Exactly.
reimbursement, for getting into clinical trials on the EFS. All these are toolboxes, and we do about 85% of our work with startups, and it's one of the earliest things I ask is, have you connected with MDIC yet? And like you'll go out and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on consultants when you can join MDIC and probably even get better guidance and toolboxes.
Well, thank you for being an ambassador for MDIC. I appreciate that endorsement. Yeah, that's absolutely critical. I mean, Nest certainly we have frameworks for data quality, frameworks for data analysis, right? These are all tools that folks can learn from. One other point about where we're also headed as an organization is generating a lot more case studies, right? We have plenty of examples, and we continue to develop them all the time around explaining exactly how a company went through a particular, challenge or just, some stage in the innovation cycle, and how they used MDIC product to get there, right? And so those case studies will be particularly instructive, and we're building out that library of case studies across multiple programs. And that's exactly where you can come in and learn as an early stage company, is like, how did others do it successfully? And we'll be increasingly developing programs where we'll have leaders from various med tech companies actually, speaking live about what did they do to get across a certain hurdle, and how did they use MDIC products to get there.
Awesome. Well, I hope some of our clients, partners have heard or seen themselves in our conversation today and pick up I wouldn't pick up the phone. We don't do that anymore. Right? Start typing into our iPhone, MDIC, how to become a member. Is there anything we didn't chat about today, Andy, that we should have?
I think we've covered a lot of the key points, Joe. I'll really just say MDIC is driving innovation fundamentally at a collaborative level with key stakeholders, including with regulators. It's a forum like no other that I know of. And I would simply say, that it is a fantastic value proposition for medtech innovators, developers of all sizes at all stages of the, kind of the company stage and commercial progress to come into the organization and learn more to do better for patients.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you being here and sharing the message, and congratulations on getting year 1 under your belt.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure.
I'm Joe Mullings from 160 Studios. Be well.